Signing as well.
Just in relation to a couple of things that you said, Minister, there, talking about it being a constitutional problem, I don't think that anyone for a second believes that we'd have to change the Constitution to allow people to exercise a right that they ultimately should already have and do already have. And we've had that conversation around GDPR and law, and there's a recognition now that GDPR applies here. So people have a right to this information, and saying that it's a constitution, there's a constitutional barrier there, I think is ridiculous. There's no constitutional barrier to people accessing their information. It's also acting like this bill is doing them some kind of a favour, and ultimately I think it's worth questioning, do we even need this bill, this legislation? If we just acknowledged people's rights to their information, we wouldn't be sitting here having these long debates about these things. And the other false narrative that is continuously spun, and to the point where even the opposition are kind of saying the same lines, is that we have to balance the right of the parent to their privacy, to the right of the adoptant person's right to information. And like, that is not based on any kind of reality. What we heard on the committee during pre-leg was that there's more people registering a no contact preference who are the adopted people, not the parents. And there's this constant narrative that what the government are doing, what this legislation is doing, is trying to protect the parents who have a right to privacy. Where has that come from? It's these constant lines that we hear that are based on no reality, as far as I can tell, after like what was a long process of pre-legislative scrutiny, different representative organisations coming in, different people coming in. Of course, we'd have loads of personal engagement with individuals who've been affected by this. It's almost as if you're trying to, the narrative creates this kind of feeling of trying to protect parents from their children, and it's just unnecessary and untrue. And then just finally, the point you made at the end of your contribution there, Minister, about Section 30 and saying that it was, you referenced people like Dr. Maeve O'Rourke and Dr. Fred Logue suggesting that an information session is just a must-have. That's like really the opposite of what we heard from experts. And you said, it's been recommended by so many reputable sources. What we heard on the committee was it being refuted by so many reputable sources that we don't need that mandatory information session. And that seems to me like cherry-picking information to argue for something that is unnecessary and that people have highlighted over and over again. It's insulting for them. And like Deputy Batchik said, the suggestion that it came, the one you're citing there, that came from years ago when people were still just trying to get even this legislation moving. We have come a long way from there. And I think like not only us in here, but the whole country has come a long way in terms of just saying enough now, enough of these different barriers and different things put in place and these kind of narratives around people's situations. It's not necessary, and it's not true often as well. I think this, I think that you've done a lot of work in this area since you've become a minister, and I think if there's one thing you change in this legislation, this seems to be the thing that means so much to people. Please consider it. I don't think we have to stick to it. That's what we heard from lots of experts in this area in pre-legislative scrutiny. I'm actually pleading with you, Minister, to please reconsider this one.
Deputy Ward.
To make every effort to offer assistance and support rather than just as far as practicable. I think people just feel like it's staggering that after everything we know that the lesser category of assistance and support is suitable. Similarly, 333, 334 and 335 are about ensuring that relevant people are provided with assistance rather than the lesser category of support. So adopted people and their relatives need help and a removal of barriers. That has been the paramount function of this bill. 333 removes the paternalistic as it considers appropriate sentence. Adopted people should decide what is appropriate and necessary, not the state bodies. And 337 provides specifically for trained archivists to be involved in the process who can provide the expertise that people need in accessing records and information. 336 removes a restriction on when counselling services can be offered. 337 ensures that. I suppose just because we're coming to the end of this, I think this process, the whole purpose of this legislation was to provide unfettered access, and you keep using that terminology yourselves, but after going through 300 amendments, not one of them being accepted, I just wonder, like, are we completely confident that people are going to get unfettered access to their information? Because what we've just discussed over and over again at great length is why people don't feel like that will happen. For one, it's distrust in state agencies, and bodies and their experiences for decades of being treated that way. And then for two, it's that they had very many concerns about the specific language in this bill, and none of those amendments have been accepted. So I suppose just as it's coming to a close, reassurance that people will have that unfettered access, I think, would be appropriate.
Well, it is our purpose to propose unfettered access, and this bill has developed from its heads of bill, and changes were made between the heads of bill and the provision of this draft legislation. And since the publication of the draft legislation, I've brought forward a set of amendments, I think important amendments, which have been agreed by this committee. And in the context of the significant number of amendments that we've discussed, I have agreed to go back to Parliamentary Council in terms of the wording and implementing a number of those amendments where I felt those amendments were strengthening the bill, where I felt those amendments were chiming with that view that we all have of bringing about a better piece of legislation. And where I didn't agree with the provisions of the legislation, with the amendments being brought forward, I think I put forward clear arguments for that, primarily on the issue of that the issues concerned were already addressed in the bill. Now, there are one or two areas, and there are important areas where there is a clear disagreement, and we had the opportunity to discuss that, and I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to discuss that in report stage. But I've carefully considered every amendment here, and I've given them fair consideration, and I feel I've answered the concerns that have been brought forward as to why those amendments weren't implemented. But as I say, myself and officials will go back to the Office of Parliamentary Counsel on a number of the points that have been raised, and we'll continue to look to strengthen this piece of legislation. And I've also indicated that I'll be bringing forward new amendments on a number of points, again with a view of strengthening this legislation and making sure all information is available to adopted people, to those who are subject to illegal birth registrations.